So welcome to the third virtual Cafecito lecture. Cheers to everybody that has their cup of coffee. It is 3 p.m. in Florida, 3:30 and 12:30 in Pacific time. To our today's guest is Dr. Andres Garzon-Oechsle. He just graduated from Florida Atlantic University. So again, congratulations. And he is currently all the way in San Diego, California. He is now a postdoctoral researcher with the Institution of Oceanography in Scripps in San Diego. So thank you so much, Andres, for talking to us about your amazing research that you've been doing for a while now in Ecuador. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for EPAN for throwing this great series of events in Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm here to share with you my research in Ecuador. You know, with archaeology in Latin America, we usually are hyper-focused in areas like Mexico or Guatemala or Peru because of their giant monumental architecture. So for me to be able to show you the wonderful world of the coastal Ecuadorian cultures is a real treat. And let's not get deceived by just all that giant architecture. Complex cultures have so much more to give than just piles of rock. So with that in mind, I begin my lecture. So I study the Manteño culture or the Manteño civilization. They're a coastal Ecuadorian culture that were around for almost 1,000 years, all the way from like the 7th century to the 17th century. The Manteño are basically the end of a long progress of traditions in the coast of Ecuador that dates back at least 8,000 years, if not more. They were the culture that was there when the Spanish started their colonization process of South America, and where all the Spanish explorers started to writing bits of information about these South American cultures. The Manteño are known for their black and brown burnished pottery. It's, to me, kind of cracks me up because a lot of Ecuadorian ceramics in the past were extremely colorful, polychromes with iridescent painting, but the Manteño decided no, the style is going to be black paste with black slip with a black burnish, and to me, I actually find it very beautiful. So you can see how they represented their people, they represented their women, their men, and also they represented intersex people, which is very interesting in the archaeological record. I like to call the Manteño kind of the most famous culture that people don't know about, because you've all seen them. If you've, you know, as good archaeologists have seen Indiana Jones, the first one, the Ark of the Covenant, you'll see that the very famous first scene where, you know, as good old Indiana Jones is looting artifacts from a temple, a giant boulder tries to crush him, rightly so. But you'll see that that room where the boulder falls almost on him is surrounded by these little Manteño chairs. The Manteño chairs are made out of stone, and they were used as the seat of power for important people in the community, and they're the most famous artifact. But the Manteño are known for being very coastal people. They sailed all across the up and down the Pacific coast of the Western Americas, all the way to the south of Mexico and all the way to the north of Chile. But in order to understand the Manteño, we need to understand a little bit about the region. There are two basic geographic features that dictate the climate of the area and also the ways of living of people today and the past. Those are the Pacific Ocean and the Chongon-Colonche coastal mountain chain. And this makes the region have a bimodal climate regimen, meaning that half the year you have the rainy season, or what the natives there call the invierno, where you get the majority of the rain of the year, but you get it concentrated in very few months, specifically January, February, March. And the rest of the year, you have the dry season, or they call it garua, and garua is the name for this coastal mist or coastal fog that develops during this time, which makes the area very wet, very muddy, overcast, but it does not translate into a whole lot of precipitation, so it is truly a dry season. My area of study is in the southern area of the Manteño territory. Specifically, this is the ethnohistoric chiefdom that was recognized in the 16th century by Spanish explorers called Salangomé. And Salangomé is composed by many ecological regions that offered the Manteño and people to the incredible resources to exploit. So starting from the coast, you have the coastal strip or the coastal base that's populated by dry brush vegetation. And this is the heart of Manteño civilization. Like I mentioned, the Manteño were incredibly seafarers. They built these giant balsas made out of balsa wood that could fit up to 50 people and that could traverse the ocean all the way to Mexico and all the way to Chile. They managed this through an incredible network of exchange based on these beautiful shells that you can see there. They're called spondylus. They come in two species, one red and one purple, and they can be manufactured into beautiful jewelry that coastal Peruvian cultures loved and also Mexican cultures loved too. So the Manteños are very much the merchants of the Pacific. But the interior of their territory, it was occupied by these vast valleys of dry forest environments. And this is really where the Manteño were able to exploit these river valleys for agriculture. Also where the center of their cotton industry was located and their timber industry was located. The Manteño had incredible textiles that were shared throughout the entire territory. As you move into the interior, into the mountain chains of the Chongon Colonche, the humidity starts rising and the environment starts transitioning into this transitional semi-deciduous forest. This is actually the breadbasket of the descendant communities today, where most people have their fields and their farms, and it offers an incredibly fertile area for the growth of many different plants and animals that people consume today and in the past. And some of these are very familiar to you guys, and they're actually domesticates from this region, like peanuts. So you gotta thank the Manteños for your delicious peanut butter. As you move up in elevation, you get to the evergreen forest. This is what was believed to be the frontier of the Manteño, as it is kind of a frontier today. Very few people live in this environment, only small communities, and they mainly make their living out of hunting animals, exploiting the forest for resources, and transform it into agricultural fields as well. And finally, when you get to the tippy toes of the mountain, you get to the Garua or cloud forest. This is definitely an edge within the today's civilization that occupies the coast of Ecuador, and it is home to a various plants and animals like that are related to animals from the Amazon. So you get a lot of capuchin monkeys, you get howler monkeys, an incredible variety of vegetation. So all of these resources were available to the Manteño, but the Manteño had to be able to occupy these environments and exploit them. So our work through the Florida Atlantic Archaeological Field School in Ecuador has been to analyze the boundaries of Salangome to try to determine how far did the Manteño go in what environments they exploited. So in the last 10 years or so, we've been surveying the area of the cloud forest, the evergreen forest, and the transitional forest. And what we've come to find out is that the cloud forest is not really one of these boundary areas for the Manteño, but it's actually a central place. And we know this by documenting almost over 126 stone foundations so far within only 3 river valleys in the western slopes on one of these mountains, which is an incredible density of people for such a rugged and difficult terrain. Some of these buildings came in groups of up to 22, so entire towns were present there, and some of them were pretty big, about 30 to 40 meters long by 15 to 20 meters wide, which is quite the house. I would love to have a house that big. We also know that the Manteño heavily occupied the area and consider this area as a central place by the excavation of one of these buildings. The Florida Atlantic Field School spent 3 seasons excavating a single structure about 13 meters by 7. And within this just consolidated space, we were able to find turquoise from Mexico, lapis lazuli from Chile, tuna spines from the Pacific Ocean, and all copper from Peru, and all kinds of exotic goods and fine artifacts that showed that the people that lived in this cloud forest were not at the periphery of their society, but were in fact at the center of it. In addition to the artifacts, we found that in the house a very identifiable way of living, even though the Manteños are a process, the culmination of a process in the Americas separate from the rest of the world. What we found is something very relatable. We found a household with a kitchen in the back, buried with a dog burial next to it, and this dog was buried with all of the care in the world. We found a grave inside the house as one of the occupants of the house, and a massive trash pit that was used for waste. So a lot of the activities that were happening in this place, some are things that we can relate onto today in what is our own households. But this area is subject to massive amount of change, and here's where the climate change aspect of this research comes into play, is that you have these varied environments, these incredible resources for the Manteño to exploit, this evidence of these massive settlements all throughout the territory, but these were at the mercy of these major climatic changes brought by El Niño-Southern Oscillation. As you can see in the picture on the left, when we do have a strong El Nino phase of ENSO, massive amounts of flooding are possible during the rainy season. You can even have an extended rainy season that may last almost up to a year. And the opposite phase of ENSO, La Niña, can bring incredible drought, as you can see in the picture on the right. Those are actually the same location. That is the biggest river in floodplain in the region where I work, called the Ayampe River, and you can see its torrential torrent of water caused by El Nino on the left, and also the dry riverbed with water trucks pumping directly from the riverbed to fill the needs of the communities nearby during La Nina. And when we speak about the Manteño, we are speaking about 1,000 years of history. So it is difficult to break down such a long occupation without really having a written language, or with very little surviving contact as far as folk tales and narratives and stories, right? So we need to try to figure out, how can we talk about these 1,000 years in a way that makes sense? And a way of doing this is looking at climate change through those 1,000 years and how this climate change affected El Niño-Southern Oscillation. So through paleoenvironmental research, we know that El Niño-Southern Oscillation starts with the early Holocene, but we reach the regular periodicity of El Nino events during the mid-Holocene, so around 5,000 years ago. During the time of the Manteño, though, there are three major climate changing events that affected the climate in the region and the world climate. First, from around the 7th century to around the 10th century, you have a period around the planet that tends to give moisture to the Yucatan and to the Caribbean seasonally, was incredibly displaced south over Ecuador. So the consequence of this was terrible droughts to the Maya world, which caused what is known now as the Maya collapse, or the classical Maya collapse, but it brought a bunch of rain to the Manteño lands. Then you have a major change in global average temperatures, known as the Medieval Climate Anomaly, which translated to the area with the coldest sea surface temperatures recorded and very bad prolonged droughts. Now, that was followed by what is called the Little Ice Age, where global temperatures plummeted, and that signaled the return of warmer waters and El Nino-like conditions. Now, the time between these two major global climate changing events was a time of incredible swings in ENSO and consequences for Manteño, as we will see. So keeping this in mind, knowing that this cloud forest was not a periphery, and that we can talk about the Manteño based on these climate changing processes, I attempted to investigate the three very simple but important questions. First, why were the Manteño in the cloud forest? It's an incredibly difficult place to live today. How did they manage to live in such a difficult environment? And finally, when did this process happen? And how does that relate to these global climate changing events? I know I have not a whole lot of time, so I'll try to go as quick as I can through a lot of this. So basically, the methodologies and theories that I used, I borrow from archaeology, remote sensing, and climate change science. By themselves, these fields tend to have major problems, but together these problems can be mitigated. Archaeology, first of all, why do we excavate? Why us and why now, right? Who are we to decide to dig something? Are we the descendant community? Do we have access? Why now? Why not 10 years later when the technology is going to get better? Or so, there's always has to be a reason because archaeology is destructive, as you all know. Finally, with remote sensing technologies, it provides an incredible amount of information and technology, but sometimes remote sensing experts just don't know what to do with all this incredible information, right? And they don't consider the past because the past leaves a mark on the landscape. So usually when people that do remote sensing look at their data, they don't think about a site 10, 20, 30,000 years ago that may have an impact on the landscape. And finally, climate change science, it's kind of depressing, and climate change science doesn't really give you a whole lot of alternatives and it shows you a bleak future. It also doesn't include past human agency all the time and only looks into technical solutions and not traditional knowledge most of the time. So together we can, with archaeology, remote sensing, and climate change, we can protect sites, we can excavate what's threatened, we can understand the scale and depth of human experience, and we can find alternatives of living and interactions with the environment that can help us today and perhaps give us some hope. But all this information just stays within scientists, among scientists, and for scientists, unless we share it with the public, just like EFPAN does. So with the decolonization mindset and public archaeology, we can create this modern archaeology with a purpose. So keeping that in mind, trying to solve these questions of why the cloud forest. In order to solve that, I use what is called an NDVI change detection analysis. Basically, what this does is looking at vegetation health based on the light that it reflects and the light that it absorbs. The more light or the healthier a canopy is, the greener it's going to look, right? So it's going to reflect more green and it's going to reflect more infrared light. The drier a canopy or the more unhealthy a canopy is doing, it's actually going to absorb a lot of these wavelengths. So you can actually have a visual representation of how well a canopy is doing. So I took different maps or satellite images, sorry, from the last 20 years and 30 years and different phases of El Niño-Southern Oscillation, different intensities of those phases to see how was this region affected at this local level. And what I was able to find out is that the elevation of the Chongon-Colonche Mountains near the coast in the area of Salangome actually creates two moisture trap zones that provide moisture year-round to these areas. And this moisture comes in the form of that coastal fog that forms during the dry season. In lower elevations, this coastal fog does not precipitate and it just kind of lofts off and it doesn't really affect the vegetation. But in these moisture trap zones, because of the change in elevation, a lot of this moisture precipitates through the canopies themselves. So it really keeps the entire area green year round. So basically the answer to why the Manteño were investing so much in this difficult environment like the cloud forest was that they're investing essentially in their most resilient environment to their changing conditions with El Niño-Southern Oscillation. But now we not understand how. How did a culture that was so related to coastal processes and trade and fishing and just ways of living that are managed by the sea. How do they manage to occupy these difficult mountains? How do they manage to produce food in these difficult mountains? Well, the solution came by using a mobile mapping system with a drone and LiDAR. And the idea here is to be able to peer the canopy virtually and see what's in between all these Manteño sites we have previously documented. So I'll show you a little bit how this drone works. There it is taking off. And here it is landing. There we go. And this is the raw data that the drone collects. In the left, you can see the laser scan with trees, ground, everything that the laser picks up. And on the right, you can see that the image of the camera of the drone itself. So what do you do with all that information? Well, you fly systematically in the areas where you want to cover ground. And then through a very complex algorithm that uses the different sensors in the mobile mapping system, you are able to what is called georeference that entire point cloud. So meaning that every single point that the drone was, or the laser scanner was able to pick, is actually in its exact location on Earth. Now, with the point cloud georeference, we can, through some segregating algorithms, you can remove the entire canopy and just keep those few points that were able to go through the entire canopy, hit the ground, and go back to the sensor. So what this gives you, it's a digital elevation model or digital terrain model of the surface underneath this thick canopy. So doing that, I was able to map this about 1.2 kilometers square of the cloud forest surrounding these Manteño sites and segregate these maps by slope. So what you can see there, the greens are very flat ground, while the yellows, orange, and reds are steeper, steeper, and steeper slopes. So the ideas here was trying to find these flat areas in these steep slopes where the Manteño possibly modified the ground in order to accommodate not only their houses, but also their agricultural fields. Now, remote sensing technology is just as good as your ground truthing. You cannot really claim things that you have not seen on the ground. So my efforts with LiDAR were followed by a ground truthing, and I was able to document about 16 terrace groups and about 6 water retention ponds and about 3 water channels that were spotted in the LiDAR and verified in the field. Now, of these, I picked up 3 landscape modifications to analyze further through the use of trenching. Now, trenching, what gives you, it's a nice stratigraphic profile of the terrace or the modification to see how it was built and who built it and what was it for. So the first one was Manteño cultivation terraces. I was able to investigate 2 types of terraces and also water retention ponds with these clay berms. So the results of this analysis are that the Manteño were able to have this dense population in the clouds forest by modifying the landscape, by turning this abrupt terrain into agricultural terraces, water retention ponds, and water distribution channels. They were able to turn this cloud forest into their breadbasket. But finally, the last question to answer was when? When did this process happen? When did the Manteño decide to move into the cloud forest? How long did they stay there? And finally, when they abandoned it for good? So that was solved by taking soil samples from each of these modifications. So 2 of the agricultural terraces and the water retention ponds to try to find charcoal, because charcoal gives us dates, and tiny pieces of charcoal can be interpreted as the presence of fire. And now, in this very wet environment like the cloud forest, fires tend to be something that is only produced by humans during the very dry conditions. So throughout this process of looking for charcoal, I was lucky enough to get a carbonized piece of corn from one of the agricultural terraces, which was fantastic because it gave me the evidence that they were indeed cultivation terraces. But this also motivated me to get corn from one of the houses that we excavated with the field school in order to tie these residential spaces with the agricultural spaces together. The soil samples from each modification were processed through nested sieves with 2 millimeters, 1 millimeter, and half millimeter openings. After that, they were put into a chlorine treatment in order to break apart any organics and any kind of clay soils that were left. And they were sieved again through the 2 millimeter, 1 millimeter, and half millimeter sieves. The goal of this was to recover just the gravel, artifacts, and the pieces of charcoal left behind. The charcoal was sent for dating. I had different results with different landscape modifications. One of the landscape modifications sadly only gave me one piece of charcoal good enough for dating. But the good thing about that one is that it gave me actually the oldest date associated with the Manteño in the region. The second terrace had an incredible preserved stratigraphy, and I was able to get 5 or 6 pieces of charcoal from in situ from this terrace. So that one was great to do this fire history reconstruction. And finally, the water retention pond was actually returned, the dates returned later than expected. They were mostly from the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Now, at first that was a little disappointing, but it actually provides a signal of the returning communities to the region to kind of like really fill up this whole narrative of occupation in the cloud forest. So anyways, with the dates, I was able to create an H-step model, meaning that the dates were chronologically ordered, which first gives you the evidence that the Manteño did not plow their agricultural fields, which is fantastic. And second, it gives you this narrative of when this agricultural terrace was built, how long was it used for, and when was it finally abandoned. That added with the count of these tiny little charcoal particles per sample gives you this whole narrative of the use of fire and occupation in the cloud forest. The result is this soil charcoal abundance analysis graph through time. And basically, the way you read this, you go from the year 1000 all the way to the year 2000. And we'll start with, and it brings together major climate changing events, major environmental changing events, major human action changing events in this narrative of the occupation of the cloud forest in the Manteño. So we start in the year 1000. The coast of Ecuador was actually hit by a major tsunami. So that would have really affected coastal communities and pushed people inland from the fear of having your towns destroyed again by a tsunami. Now, this all occurred during the period of the Medieval Climate Anomaly, which we know produced major droughts in the region. So that would have motivated people in the coast to move inland to go after that coastal fog that only forms at high elevations and it only precipitates, let's say, at high elevations. This difficult time was also intercalated by an extreme El Nino event, meaning that already through these dry conditions, you had one El Nino event that was devastating. And usually when you have really bad drought and upcoming flood, it's even more devastating because vegetation is not strong enough to hold off water. You get a lot of erosion, a lot of flooding. So it's usually a bad time. To that was also followed with the eruption of one of the central Andean Ecuadorian volcanoes called Quilotoa. The mountain basically blew its top, so it created the largest volcanic footprint of the Holocene in the northern Andes. So it was quite the eruption. So that would have also greatly affected the Manteño, and mostly it affected the Manteño at the center and north of their territory. So the area in the south where I work was barely affected by this eruption. So that would have meant that people from the center and north parts of their territory were most likely forced south to the area of Salangome. To that, it's followed by this very volatile time between the medieval climate anomaly and the Little Ice Age, where You had extreme El Nino events, so extreme flood followed by extreme drought, decades of drought, and this is where you start getting the occupation of the Manteño in the cloud forest, just really motivated by these drought conditions. And the creation of this terrace, which has a stone retaining wall, appears to happen in this time of extreme weather events. So the idea here was to develop a resilient agricultural system to drought, but also a resilient system that can withstand massive amounts of flood. Finally, you get fire activity throughout this era, coinciding with times of drought, and you have less fire activity in times of floods and excessive rain. And then there's a major stratum change within the activity of the terrace, which signals kind of the agricultural abandonment of it and it being used more as a refuse dumping area. And this really coincides with the change in global climate change to the Little Ice Age. So weather conditions, more common El Nino events would have made life in the cloud forest more difficult. So that perhaps led to the abandonment, temporary abandonment of this agricultural terrace. However, to this weather changing event is followed by Spanish contact. And the Spanish infectious diseases were devastating to the Manteño as they did not have any immunities to it. And estimates say that about 9 out of 10 people in these coastal towns perished. That would have created a demographic catastrophe for the Manteño. It would have broken all of their trade networks, and it would have turned these cloud forest environments into their last refuge. And this is what we see in the charcoal. We see a huge uptick in the use of fire in the region right after Spanish contact, possibly evidence of this huge influx of people into the mountains. But soon after this, we see the complete abandonment of the cloud forest in the 17th century. And this coincides with this effort by the Spanish colonial government to replenish the dwindling colonial towns by grabbing people from the surrounding mountains and forcing them into these colonial towns. I kind of summarized all of this through the graph, so I'm just going to skip through this and quickly talk a little bit more about why does this matter. So now we have a nice climate resiliency narrative for the Manteño, and we can understand those 1,000 years a little bit better. Now, if this knowledge just stays within science, it doesn't really have an effect on the descendant population. So the importance here is sharing it. And one of the things that I like to think about that why this research matters is that in archaeology, we often look at the Americas and the tropics as places where these civilizations collapsed, failed, or did not take off ever, right? The classic example is the Maya collapse, or we have the cautionary tale of Easter Island, or rightly called Rapa Nui, and how they, cut the last tree in their island, which caused a demographic collapse. Not so much. These were very intricate, very complex processes. For the Maya, what collapsed was their social hierarchy, not people. And for Easter Island, what caused collapse was actually European contact, not people's behavior. So here I have a quote from Reverend Nguyengro's book, The New Dawn, which basically says that we need to have broader imagination within archaeology. We are so conditioned to think about societies in the way that our society is, that we cannot even imagine free societies without strict hierarchies. We cannot imagine societies with productive agricultures that do not destroy environments. And we cannot imagine societies that actually invest in the longevity of generations after than just the next quarter. So if something did go terribly wrong in human history, and given the current state of the world, it's hard to deny something did, then perhaps it began to go wrong precisely when people started losing the freedom to imagine and enact other forms of social existence, to such a degree that some now feel this particular type of freedom hardly ever existed or was barely exercised for the greater part of human history. I believe that the Manteño are a great example of how complex civilizations can actually modify their environments in a way that they're resilient and are have longevity and is not destructive. And that resiliency lies in the Manteño's strong social networks. It is the connections between this incredibly variety of environments that made the Manteño extremely strong. Because when one environment faltered because of climate, another one succeeded. So if your strong connections were able to mitigate for that, you will have a resilient society. The end of Manteño happened with Spanish contact. Again, the demographic collapse was too much to keep the language going, to keep a lot of traditions going. But there are bits and pieces of this ancient culture still in the people of Manabí. One of them is the way that people cook, people's relationship to the ocean, and people's relationship to a lot of the produce that you and I eat today, like cacao, peanuts, yuca, sweet potato, and so on. And this all matters because climate change is happening. It is happening at a scale that is unprecedented because of human action. And we need to understand how that's going to affect the coast of Manabí and how it's going to affect El Niño-Southern Oscillation. Most likely, it's going to exacerbate El Nino events, exacerbate La Nina events, and make them more frequent. And the people of Manabí need to be ready for that. That's why sharing this story of resiliency is incredibly important, and we've done it with a lot of public archaeology events, thanks to the input from EPENT and the help from Sarah. We used 3D prints of artifacts, landscapes. We used cookie excavation, drawing archaeologists. We've incorporated archaeology into ecotourism tours. We've incorporated landscape maps and 3D models into the local museums as well, and hosted several conferences in our research center. Another kind of present project of mine was communicating this story to children through the use of Minecraft. I created a one-to-one cloud forest Manteño world based on real sites, real buildings, and a lot of imagination too. There's a little bit of what it looks like in action. And finally, another reason this is incredibly important, as it is within all the Americas indigenous communities, is building a case for ancestral identity. In Ecuador, land rights are tied to you being able to prove that you're an ancestral community, and usually communities in the coast are not seen as indigenous, and they are indigenous, as you can see. These are the same people that have been occupying the region for at least the last 8,000 years. And again, the end of all of this is building modern archaeology with a purpose. To me, this little drawing is worth as much as a presentation, as a paper, as a book. This is a descendant community, a little girl, Guadalupe Gonzalez, who drew a Manteño chair with the sun sitting in its seat of power. It seems like they are really connected to their environment still. I want to thank all the communities and all the institutions that made this work happen. And of course, EPEN and Natalie for inviting me to give this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andres. This was amazing. And I feel like I personally have a few questions, but I'm going to open it first to anybody else in the audience who has this particular question to go ahead. You can write it in the comments, or you can unmute yourself and feel free to now engage in dialogue and ask anything you'd like to Dr. Garzon-Oechsle.
You might want to type it. It's kind of hard.
Oh, well, I was going to ask a question before. I was just going to unmute and ask, Andres, thank you so much for your talk. It was so interesting. And I still learn everything, like something new every presentation. And I was just wondering, you talked a little bit about the Manteño being resilient because of their connections. And I was wondering if you could extrapolate that to you know, there have been a lot of think pieces in like the New York Times and other publications about the lack of connection in American society, like friendship and other social connections. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about the importance of social connections in Ecuador and with the Manteño.
Oh, absolutely. So this is something that's really fascinating, and I'm starting to really get into it now, especially with my work here and my work that I'll be carrying out in Puerto Rico. And it's how landscape and how settlement patterns really affect societies and how it affects social connections. In Manabi, people have extremely strong family ties, first of all. And not only nuclear family ties, but extended family ties. So this really helps people in times of need. No one goes hungry in the coast of Ecuador. First of all, the region is incredibly productive, but at the same time, you can depend on people around you. So if the fishing is bad, people can depend on the agriculture. If the agriculture is bad, people can depend on the fishing. So it's really the interconnection of these varied environments that keep people fed and keep the environment resilient. Sorry, I want to add something to this too, is some of the work that I'm starting to get into in Puerto Rico has a great example of this, how just changing settlement patterns can really affect these connections. And it's, with the attempt of the United States government to control housing sprawls in Puerto Rico, they moved a bunch of people into these giant buildings with apartments, and essentially dissolved tiny towns. And the consequences of this is like your little corner store is gone, your little lavanderia next to you is gone. Like all of these kind of informal businesses that keep a town being a town were completely decimated and gone. So people started hating these like huge high-rise buildings and apartment living, because it breaks down that something as simple as being able to put your own business in your house can really disrupt this this way of life. So very similar to the Manteño. I mean, once you sever that connection with the coast, these inland towns could not survive.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Cool. Okay. Thank you, Andres. And I'm like so shocked by, the amount of questions that you were able to answer thanks to all of your very rigorous methodology, like the ground truthing, the laser scanning. It was so much went, had to happen for you to answer those questions. And I personally enjoy seeing the whole process of archaeology from the very beginning to the end, and the fact that even the community aspect was included in your entire presentation. And I wanted to ask, in that last part, I saw that you incorporated games into the way that you shared the results of your research. So I wanted to know, what was the response to using something like Minecraft to talk about climate change, talk about resiliency, and talk about all of the work you've been doing in Ecuador all of these years?
Of course. So the micro project kind of happened during COVID. So one of the things that we were facing with during COVID is the lack of tourism. And this area highly depends on tourism now for capital. And a little museums and communities also depend on this capital. So with everything closed, it was very difficult to keep it going, to try to find any kind of like way of promoting the area or keeping active, and also to give back to the community. So this was part of a small grant that we got through the Spanish government to basically virtualize the museum, make it a virtual museum. So part of it included a nice website. Out here, I'll put it on the chat with 3D models, and the Minecraft game kind of started as a side project where I just kind of wanted some digital way to reconstruct these landscapes and houses. And once we got this grant, I was able to develop it into a full game. which was it's still completely available for free on the website. And I've had hundreds of downloads. I really haven't had a whole lot of feedback because, again, it was a project through COVID, so it was difficult to really incorporate or just talk to people about it. But one of the things I've been wanting to do, and it's just been kind of difficult to actually do it fairly recently, but is to actually go to a lot of these internet cafes and places where people play video games and try to put a computer there and install the game and have people do it. So hopefully that's something I'll be able to develop so I can get more of a feedback. Now, where I was able to really see a just incredible feedback from people was through the public archaeology activities we had. We did 2 schools in 2 different towns, 2 communities I work with, and these kids had never been exposed to their culture in that way. They've learned like the cultures in the past as you learn in school and you just recite them by memory, but to see them like draw an archaeologist or like try to replicate the stone chairs and look at the 3D prints and do the cookie excavation and just kind of have this interactive way of seeing the past and how excited like Sarah or I would get about the past would just really make them very extremely grateful of the whole event and kind of putting their past in a light that perhaps they didn't see. So to me, that was incredible. Yeah. Also, they're incredibly good at cookie excavation. We had to turn around the cookies so they keep getting them out because no one destroyed them. And the only kids that kind of destroyed them is because they were too hungry and they just ate the cookie.
Thank you. I am so glad that you were able to do that project, especially during the pandemic where everything went remote and everything went virtual. You still managed to get that information out there. And in my face, it like was when you said it was funded by the Spanish government. I was like, wow,
I
really?
know,
How
right?
interesting is that?
That's the institution. So it's to help museums in Latin America, like community museums.
That's awesome. And I'm going to go ahead and ask another question. And it is, finding so many, uh, it, you have such incredible data out of just the ground truthing, the laser, but also the excavations and even the oral history aspect of things. Did any new questions arise that now you're interested? Like if you have the opportunity to continue work there, what new questions would you ask?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. There's still so much. So first, we don't know the boundaries of this historic chiefdom. We just don't know, because the area where we thought it was the boundary turns out to be 126 buildings or more, possibly way more. So where does it end? In the other side of the mountain, the next valley? We just don't know. So one of the big questions is chasing those boundaries and seeing, where does it end? The next one is identifying those moisture trap zones. Where I work is not the only one. Just by looking at the map, you can see, oh, there's a green area here and a green area here that have never been investigated. So I am pretty sure that these mountains are going to be full of archaeological sites as well. And then finally, it's interesting how I'm glad you appreciated kind of the process of the research, because when I set myself to do this a long time ago, I kind of just wanted to find a site in Ecuador and dig a site in Ecuador, right? Like that was like my top idea. But as more and more sites started popping off and all this information started kind of coming up, and kind of like the importance or the moral imperative of that it is climate change right now, it just sort of led me to this major kind of field of study now, which is climate change in the past. And to me, I think like the most exciting way of portraying this information, portraying this civilization is as an alternative to this idea of collapse. This is 1,000 years of history. This country is not even 300. It's 1,000 years of history where this culture is not unchanged, but very little like changed as far as style, ways of living, production. It's just more and more of the same, right? So it just seems like They were just very good at exploiting their environments. And the last thing I love about them is you never find weapons, you don't find fortresses, you don't find defensive walls. They're not like the northern Peruvian societies that were like killing each other all the time and had to build like, 20-foot walls, or like the Mesoamerican societies that were raiding each other all the time. Like they just seem to be either like extremely good at controlling commerce, so no one would mess with them because not even the Inca wanted to mess with them, or they were just nice and people didn't want to attack them. But yeah, there's lots of really interesting questions to follow.
I will now forever relate the Manteño culture as peaceful culture I have learned about in my recent years alive, which is awesome. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions, Andres. And thank you so much for accepting to be here and sharing all of your amazing work with us. We are definitely excited that you're continuing to do more work around the topic of climate change at such a cool place as the Scripps Center of Marine Archaeology. So again, congratulations on that. And if audience, you are interested in learning more, we're definitely going to publish this presentation on our YouTube, along with, Andres's professional contact, so you can ask him questions if you have, you didn't have the opportunity, or if you see this YouTube afterwards, you want to shout out. Now we do have a couple of lectures. Next week, we have another one, and please go to fpan.us to see all of the events that we have during National Hispanic Heritage Month for the Honrando Nuestra Historia series of events. There's still much left of happening in all of South Florida, and we hope to see you there. And thank you so much for being a part of this Cafecito lecture. And thank you again, Andres.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for inviting me.
Thank you.